Okay, welcome to LS573. This is an introduction, and we're going to talk about Integrated Library System, or ILS. Okay, let's go to the first slide. By the way, this presentation, the PowerPoint of this presentation, it is or will be in your D2L site. So you can go there and download the presentation if you need to. It's not a requirement, but if you want to go over while you're listening to the video lecture, then you can have the presentation there. Okay. So automations or automation system. Okay, an automation system and integrated library system ILS are terms used to describe software that operates circulation, cataloging, public access catalog, the OPAC, reports, and other modules that do the work of typical library operations. In other words, these are systems with a number of modules that you can activate that work together. Okay, that's why they are called integrated library system. Because, for example, you have circulation and you have the patron module or the client module. Well, they work together. Okay. And of course, in the past, when we didn't have automation or integrated library systems, you may have had a computer with one or two systems but were not integrated. And if we go a little bit back in time, when I was uh, in college, for example, 30 or some years ago, um, we used the index cards. So we didn't have computers. We didn't have a online catalog. There was internet, of course, but there were no OPACs, online public access catalog. So the catalog was a piece of furniture with index cards, and there you can see what the holdings of the library were. Now we have digital catalogs and we have online catalogs, and that's part of the integrated library system. So things have improved very much with the technology in the last 30 or so years. Libraries have automation systems that manage serials, acquisitions, cataloging, circulation systems, and patron authentication. And this is very important because all of the functions and operations of the library are registered or recorded in the integrated library system. Okay, so in any moment you can have a report on how many items are in circulation, what are the late items, who has to have a fine, what patron have to have a fine, etc. In the past, it took a lot of work to have up-to-date information. With the integrated library system, you have update information. Okay, so the operation of the library becomes more reliable. One of the things that of the features of the integrated library system is that it it has remote access. It's something that you can have if you want your patrons to be able to access your resources online. You can have that remote access. One example of remote access would be our own library, the Clarendon University Library. Okay, and for this class, we're using a e-textbook that you are able to read online by accessing the library website. So remote access to a library online databases uses a patron database within the ILS system to authenticate a library patron. So if you want to, for example, read the textbook that we're using for this class, or you want to read an article, you have to authenticate yourself by your username and your password. You have to have a username and a password. And in our case, in Clarion University case, you use the same authentication as you use to log into D2L, My Clarion, and the library. It's the same credentials, your username and your password. So please make sure you have been able to access our ebook. Here, and this is very important, when it says most ILS are legacy system and are in serious need of updates. In other words, the systems that are, it says most of the systems, and it's referring to the US, are legacy system, meaning that are old systems and they need updates. It is important, and this is something that we as librarians have to be aware, to learn what has changed in the industry since the library last changed its ILS. So place yourself in a library and you're a librarian there. Well, you have to be aware of what new technologies are available to update the integrated library system of your library. That in most cases will be a legacy system, meaning it's an old system that will need update. How do we do that? Well, there is something, and this is very crucial, to do an RFP, a request for proposal. And we will see that in future lectures and video lectures about what an RFP is. After the RFP has been issued, ILS software vendors will respond and provide a demonstration. An RFP is a request for a product, and you communicate with the vendors, and they will respond because they are interested in selling their system. And they will provide demonstrations, they will go on site, or it will be online, and they will provide workshops, etc., etc., because they want you to acquire their systems. Of course, not all systems are private systems. There are online and there are public access software that you can use. And in this class, we're going to see one example of a public access system. The field of library automation is rapidly evolving and increasingly complex due to technological innovations in software, delivery servers, mergers, and competition. Unless you closely monitor the ILS software industry, it is difficult just to simply evaluate your library, write the RFP, and then view the demonstrations. So, what depending on the library size, the best way to go about this is to have a team if you want to update the system. And of course, if you have the resources. And resources do not only mean monies, but it also means technical resources and professional resources. But the best way to go about doing the RFP is knowing what resources you have in your library in terms of technology resources, in terms of software, in terms of professional and technical resources, and what are your needs. Okay? It is also important that you talk to other librarians. That's why it's so important that you attend conferences. Your state ALA chapter will have like an annual conference, and you can talk to other librarians that work in similar places like your own library to see what kind of system they are running. And in those conferences, for example, when I go to PLA, I see and talk to vendors that are there demonstrating their product. Now, what are some of types of integrated library systems? One is called a turnkey. A turnkey implementation refers to purchasing from a single vendor an integrated library system that includes both the software and the hardware. Okay, so you will get a server with the software pre-installed. You will have a network connection, data stored in server, communication with workstations. That is called the intranet. So it's not the internet is when you go outside your organization, But when you communicate with other computers within your organization, that's the internet. You can have the vendor act as a system administrator. No need for library specialized staff member. This is the turnkey system. This is one of the advantages, is that you don't have to have a IT person in your library, or none of the librarians have to be proficient in ITs. However, turnkey systems are very expensive because the vendor is providing the software and the hardware. But that means also, and this is another advantage, that there will the system as a whole will work better because there will be more integration between software and hardware. Okay, when we talk about software, we talk about programs, we talk about instructions. And when we talk about hardware, we talk about the devices itself, the computer itself, and the input and output devices. And I think we will have a class on that, on what is input and what is output devices. To give you an example, an input device is a scanner or a keyboard or a monitor. That's I'm sorry, not a monitor. A monitor will be an output device. So an input device is a device that lets you add information to the system, like a scanner, like a keyboard, like a mouse. An output device is one that lets you see the information or the data that is in your system. For example, a monitor and a printer. Okay. So another thing about the turnkey system is library intranet. We say that's the inside network. It's administered by library personnel, cabling, router, firewall, DMC, switches, security, etc. And we will have a lecture later on that explains what all this means. Okay, but for now, it is important to know that if you buy a turnkey system, they will bring the hardware and the software, and they will be in charge of the network connection and also how the data will be stored. It may be stored in your own server or may be stored in other server, in their own server. But the library itself will have to take responsibility for the intranet. The stand-alone installation describes a system in which the hardware and software are purchased separately and the system administrator library staff installs the client server software. And the client server is a model of implementation. And we'll have a lecture on that too in my information technologies lecture. In this case, when you have a standalone installation, you buy your software and you buy your hardware from different sources. This may be a good way to have an ILS, an integrated library system, but you may run into problems of integration between the software and the hardware. So you may have a single computer or several computers. You may have a server. You have workstations. Hardware might be purchased from vendor or not. You may buy the hardware from somebody else. And system administrator is library staff. Vendor support is when called. And this is very interesting. In the first case, normally, of course, that depends on the contract, but you will get support from your vendor when it's a turnkey implementation. When it's a standalone, then the vendor may support the software part, but it may not support the hardware. Okay, because you bought the hardware, the library probably bought the hardware in a different place. So that's when you run into problems. So one of the advantages of doing a turnkey implementation is that you have more support. When you do a standalone, well, you have at least two vendors there. One is a software vendor, and then the other one is the hardware vendor. And in those situations, you may have one blaming the other. Okay, that may happen. Of course, when you do a standalone, it's because you have people in your library with this IT skills. Okay, so they can support the hardware that you're running in the library. So when you are going to do a standalone, you have to make sure that you have your own resources, or at least you have a budget to have an IT to come to your library and do the support that you need. So here, let's a little bit more about standalone installations, administrator activities. This is something that you have to do because when I mean you, I mean the library, because you're in charge of the system. So you will be the administrator. You have to do backups. You have to do the maintenance to the ILS server and to the data. You will have to create report. You will have to do technical support. You have to customize your interface and your OPAC. You have to manage security. You have to do the troubleshooting to the server and to the workstations. You have to keep the network functioning, and you have to implement the new modules. In other words, that's what I say. You have to have IT personnel that could do these works. There are many librarians with a computer science background. Uh, Sometimes they are called systems librarians, and they take care of all these functions or activities as administrators. Another system is the hosted system, and the vendor hosts the library IL software purchased by the library, bibliographic records, patron records, and sometimes the library website. In other words, in this case, you may pay a monthly fee or a yearly fee, and all your information is not going to be kept inside, but it's going to be kept on the server of the vendor. Okay, and what you're going to have in your library are the clients. Okay, so you will have workstations, in other words, and the server will be at the vendor. This is a very good implementation, by the way, because then you don't have to be the administrator of the network. You will have to what you will have to be in charge of your intranet about on your workstations, but all this security and backup, etc., will be done by the company or by the vendor who is hosting your server and your information. There's a problem here, of course, and it has to do with security, the security of that information. So in this case, the hosted system, you don't need no need to have a server. You have minimal technical issues. One example of this, it has nothing to do with libraries, but maybe it can illustrate what we're talking. For example, when you use Gmail as your email server, well, Google, in this case, or Yahoo, whichever email server that you're using, they take care of maintaining the server. You don't have to have an email server because you are using somebody else's server. In this case, Yahoo or Google. Okay. Uh, in the case of, I have a website. I don't know if I had put my blog address. It's I use Blogger by Google. Well, all my information is in the Google server. I don't have a server where I publish my data, my information, my updates. No, I publish in the Google server. Well, the same thing is when you implement a hosted system. all the information is being published in the company's, in the vendor's server. So therefore, you have minimal technical issues. Vendor does troubleshooting and maintenance, but you, of course, you need a high-speed connection required because remember, all the access to your own information is going to be remote. So remember when we talk about remote access at the beginning of this lecture, and we're talking about you having being able to access Clarion Library website. Well, in this case, when you are in your own library, all the access will be remote because the information and the server with the information won't be in site. It will be at the vendor's site or the provider's site. So you need a good or a very powerful internet connection, very reliable too, because every time the connection is down, then you won't even have access to your own ILS system. Well, no, it's not yours because you're paying a fee, but you won't have access to your own information. So that's a negative right there. High-speed connection required is safe because library staff will troubleshoot LAN, local area network, or the intranet, and the internet connection because that's how you communicate with your own. That's how you upload and or download information. Vendor might offer virtual or dedicated server. That actually, when we talk about a virtual or dedicated server, means that they will have a hardware. If it's a dedicated, will be a hardware that is dedicated to your library. If it's a virtual server, your information may be in different servers. But for you, that will be transparent. Uh, in terms of security, well, the vendor is responsible. And remember, there is a lot of confidential information in ILS systems, especially in regards to patron information. We may have birth dates, we may have home addresses. There is information on driver's license or any other of state issue ID. Even social security numbers might be there, etc., etc. So we have to be very careful in terms of the patrons of the community, of the members of the community information, because that information is confidential. Not only that type of personal information, but we have other information that is confidential too, and let me say that right here. And that's and this as we as librarians have to keep the confidential information on what our patrons are reading and checking out. Okay, uh, uh, we have that duty. We have the duty to keep our patrons uh, 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 information access confidential. Okay, uh, they may or may not uh, uh, care if their information seeking behavior is known or not. But we as professionals have to keep that information behavior secret or confidential. Maybe it's not secret because we as librarians will know, but we have to keep it confidential. What kind of information our patrons are accessing. There's another implementation called software as a service, and that refers to a subscription service for web-based software. This is like the one before the hosted service. The library does not purchase the ILS software. Instead, it pays an initial fee for the ILS software plus a monthly or annual fee to the vendor. It might host a library website. Vendor is responsible of security, and software is updated. Update is vendor's responsibility. So, software as a service is part of a hosted system. Then there is open source. And open source or public access software, as I said before, but actually this is the right way to say open source software, OSS. Open source is very important because it's open source. It does not cost, it doesn't have an initial cost. However, as we will see, it has other type of costs because somebody has to do have to be the administrator of that system, and that somebody have to be part of the library. Uh, Open source is software in which a program's source code is available for individuals to use, copy, modify, and redistribute. And in this class, we are going to check several videos that we're going to be seeing online on a open source system. Library experienced library staff is needed. Here you need people with IT skills. It might be less expensive, oh, let me correct this right now. Maybe a less expensive alternative at the beginning, but it also may be more problematic to troubleshoot, especially when you are getting familiar with the software. It may give you some troubles on integration with the hardware and how to use it. It may be hard to update too. But on the other hand, it's open source, and there are also communities that are supporting this open source system or software, and you may have new features. Evaluating library facility and staffing, and this is very important to decide which of these of the implementations that we just talked about will be the best for your library. Of course, not when we talk about different implementations such as turnkey, hosted, etc. There are many in between hybrids of implementation. Okay, but these are more or less the models, and so it's a way to understand how can we implement an integrated library system in our to do um, uh, the work that we do at the library, to keep a record of what we do in the library. Okay, so some are hybrids, some may be hosted and also turnkey, or maybe open source, but we buy some support from some company that is supporting the open source, etc. But in order to know what we need, we have to know what resources does the library already possess, what similar libraries are using, what kind of integrated library system other libraries similar to ours are using, what modules are we going to implement. Are we going to implement the patron module, circulation? Are we going to implement acquisitions? Are we going to implement the serials module? Are we going to implement a the cataloging module? Are we going to have an OPAC, etc.? We're going to have remote access. Okay, what time frame is needed for the implementation? Do we have 6 months? Do we have a year? How much time do we have for that new implementation? How are we in terms of hardware and software? What kind of human resources we have? Do we have time? For example, let's say we want to do a open source software implementation. Do we have the time to study, to get familiar with the software, to implement it? Or even, do we have the expertise? Do we have the IT skills? Let me put here IT skills. Well, we have to take everything into consideration. By the way, okay, so we have reached the final slide of today's video lecture. Make sure you read this in your textbook too, and because this I probably will be testing in the final exam about the different implementations of the ILS systems and what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of each one. Okay, thank you so much.